you want to speak to the specific legal mechanisms here?
I mean, we've seen both can be changed. So, I mean, while I guess you would say that there is greater flexibility in the sense that you would have a statutory provision, there's not like an extraordinarily greater flexibility. I mean, statutory provisions are still, you know, it's often difficult to change that, as everyone who works in the legislature knows, and it's seen, you know, with the floor debate. It's still pretty difficult to change those too. There's sometimes the idea that by handing it to voters to get rubber stamped, it can be easier manipulated. So that kind of depends on the circumstances within a state. And that would be up to kind of California to decide that if they would have, if you would have greater control by making it statutory and something the legislature would be able to change, that's one thing. But the constitutional funds are altered too, just by waiting until, you know, the voters get to decide and getting, you know, the stamp. I come from Florida originally, and there was stories for years that, you know, you could just put anything on the ballot in Florida and it would get signed off on. So, you know, those states, and maybe it was easier to pass it that way. It just kind of depends from state to state.
Thank you. And I guess just a final question back to the oil severance, and it may be different state to state, but Louisiana, Alabama, Texas, do they set a threshold after which a percentage goes to reserve?
Yes. Yes.
And that's, as far as you know, true for all those states that use the oil severance?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Monin. If no other questions, thank you not only for giving us your day, but also for taking the trouble to cross country to join us. We do appreciate it.
It's my pleasure to leave snowy DC and join you in California.
Welcome to the drought. Colleagues, we are upon our third and last panel considering the structuring of a budget reserve, and we'd like to invite Tim Gage, of course, former director of the Department of Finance, Brad Williams with Capital Matrix, and formerly of our own Assembly Appropriations Committee staff, and Dr. Kim Rubin, who is a senior fellow with the Urban Institute. Welcome to you all. Boy, girl, boy, works for us.
Yes, clearly.
Mr. Gage, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator and members. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you a little bit today about these issues. They are extraordinarily important. I think it's worth going back to the question of why we're concerned about volatility. It's been brought up a number of times, but I think it's really important to keep foremost in our minds, and that is, you know, we're not interested in mitigating volatility for its own sake. We're interested in doing that in order to reduce the extent to which program funding is getting whipsawed by virtue of that volatility. And in my view, there are a number of different ways in which you need to think about attacking that problem. It's not simply a matter of building a rainy day fund. But in fact, there are a couple different approaches. And I think probably at the end of the day, you need to avail yourself of all of them, because no single approach by itself is going to do the trick. And even with these tools, you probably still can't deal with managing the volatility that we most recently experienced, given its magnitude. So the first tool is perhaps mitigating volatility in the state's revenue system, and that is having a broader, more stable revenue base. The constraint on that, however, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, the constraint is that you don't want to reduce the structure of the state's revenues, wherein when we have good economic times, you're generating a significant amount of revenue. You don't want to undercut that. So that's a fundamental constraint, but it's worth thinking about, you know, are there things that could be done to revenues that would reduce volatility and provide for a more stable revenue base? The second issue, which I'll come back to, is by building a rainy day reserve. But again, there are limits. There are practical limits to how large a reserve can be. You know, I don't think the voters are going to sit still for a $20 billion reserve, for example, in the current context, particularly in a state where we have the initiative process and it's actively used. I'm going to be a little bit of a heretic here by suggesting that another tool that you have is actually to accede to the governor's request that you unwind deferrals and accelerations. In other words, that you attack some of the items on the so-called wall of debt. Because even though those things are gimmicks, when push comes to shove and times are bad enough, you will probably end up availing yourself of them again. But you can only do that if you've put them back into your toolbox, if you've unwound them. Now, again, there are some practical constraints. You can't change, for instance, the business tax payment requirements willy-nilly because you'll make business folks crazy. But it is important to put those tools back into the toolbox. And that's somewhat heretical because they are gimmicks and they're not good things to do from a public finance perspective. But the reality is when you're faced with program cuts of the magnitude you've been faced with, you will in fact resort to those things. But you can only do that if they're available to you. And then lastly, one of the other tools here is to really understand and appreciate the magnitude of out-year spending commitments that you make, to understand the implications of those spending commitments as you look forward into the future in the context of understanding that inherently, because we have a business cycle, revenues will be somewhat unstable. And can you realistically commit yourself to an ongoing spending program of a certain sort if some of those revenues are in fact going to be non-recurring? In establishing a rainy day reserve, I think the goal has been, as it's been discussed here, is to set aside non-recurring revenues primarily. And that's so that you don't use them to fund ongoing program commitments, and also so that those monies are available to cushion the economic cycle. And in designing such a mechanism, you do face a fundamental trade-off that you've touched on in the last panel between putting a mandatory formula in the Constitution and relying on your own discipline to set the funds aside. So one approach is to establish in statute or the Constitution a mechanism to require finance and the analysts to agree on a particular number as to the amount of non-recurring revenues, and then shout that from the rooftops. Make that number or that amount of revenues that are non-recurring or related to spikes in revenues highly visible so that there is some public pressure on all of you, even if you don't have a constitutional requirement to set it aside. There is some public pressure to be responsible and to segment those revenues in some fashion. From time to time, though, that's been proven to be historically irresistible, the spending of those dollars. So it's a very difficult kind of thing. The alternative is a mandatory approach in the Constitution. The downside, of course, is that gives you limited latitude, and you've talked extensively about the kind of problems that you potentially face with respect to not having flexibility. In addition, no formula is going to be perfect. Any formula that you embrace someday will have a circumstance where it doesn't really work as effectively as you'd hoped it would. And that's simply the reality. We all live with unintended consequences of these sorts of decisions. So let me talk just very briefly about some of the considerations involved in designing a mechanism, whether it's in statute or in the Constitution itself. As I say, the goal should be to set aside revenue spikes or non-recurring revenues, and neither using a fixed percent of revenues until a reserve reaches a certain level, which is the mechanism under Proposition 58 that currently exists, nor the unanticipated revenue measure in ACA 4 really do that. They don't really get at revenue spikes per se. The administration's proposal attempts to do that by using capital gains, but as my colleague Brad Williams will talk about, there may be some better ways to think about that instead of capital gains. The important thing here is to keep the definition of revenue spikes as simple as possible and to make it transparent and credible so that people can really understand what you're trying to get at and why, for them, from a common sense perspective, it makes sense and something that they would do in their own lives if they had the opportunity. And that, I think, helps to reduce the potential for game playing on the part of a future administration, and thereby increases the legislature's ability to exercise oversight. So if you keep it simple, you've got a better chance of keeping everybody honest in the process. So even if finance makes an official estimate, at a minimum, the legislative analyst's office ought to be asked to review and comment on it. That's a bare minimum, and obviously, I think you legitimately, from the legislature's perspective, are interested in looking at what other kinds of ways should the legislature be involved in this decision. As the state's chief executive, my view is that ultimate responsibility resides with the governor to protect the state's financial stability. And for this reason, I'm generally comfortable with putting responsibility for suspending deposits in the governor's hands, kind of along the lines of the current Proposition 58, the current mechanism. In terms of withdrawals from the reserve fund, I think the key is to ensure that the reserve is able to cushion impact over a multi-year period. And I might be even a little bit more strict about that than the governor's proposal is with respect to the amount that can be drawn down in any given year. So I might limit it to a quarter or a third instead of half. Because even though historically recessions have generally been, at least in some instances, sort of V-shaped, where we've had a sharp downturn and then a fairly sharp upturn, lately, that hasn't been as much the case, and so recoveries have been slower, and we need to smooth those recoveries over a longer period of time. To the extent that the governor vetoes an appropriation of funds, within whatever percentage is allowable, those funds obviously, I think, should simply remain in the fund, and you have the existing rules with respect to vetoes and overrides by the legislature. To deal with the problem, and I think it could certainly be a problem, of too large a reserve, particularly in terms of public perception, you can specify that once you reach a certain percentage of general fund revenues, then deposits are suspended. You could do that. The problem with that is it kind of goes against the grain of setting aside revenue spikes, because to the extent that you don't set aside those revenue spikes, you again have the temptation to commit them to ongoing spending programs. So an alternative approach to deal with that is to simply permit those funds, as I think ACA 4 generally does, to be spent, although ACA 4 carves out an amount for this purpose, to allow those funds, though, to be spent for one-time purposes, primarily debt, perhaps infrastructure, those sorts of things, though. And that way, I don't have much doubt that at the end of the day, the legislature would likely, in effect, spend down the reserve to an appropriate level, given that kind of allowable spending. That's basically what I wanted to leave you with. I think one further thought, and that is that you've touched on this tension between building a reserve and restoring funding for programs, that some of which have been severely reduced as a result of the recession. And I guess I would encourage you in one respect to separate those issues, because I think they are different in one sense, and that is, even though obviously for a year like this, in real time, they are bound up with each other. But more generally, the question of what's an appropriate long-term funding level for various programs with the state is really a separate question from the issue of how to establish an appropriate reserve mechanism that basically insulates us from, to a certain extent, from the business cycle. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gage. I'm going to see if we might address a few questions to you before we go on to our last two presenters. And first of all, we appreciate your being here, especially with your fiscal experience, both in the Assembly and the Senate, and as Director of Finance. You are a unique voice, one we don't get to hear from often enough, and that you concluded with the comments that you did, because I want to keep coming back to that right now, because I think it's a real conundrum for us. And I won't repeat all the needs of non-98 spending that we have and just focus on 98, what's an appropriate level of spending? You said we have to separate that out from what is an appropriate level of reserve, though the two, of course, do have a relationship.
Sure.
But if we are currently 30% below the national average in per pupil spending, and our goal is not to stay there for another generation.
Absolutely.
Let's say we just want to get up to average. That's another $3 billion or more per year.
At least.
How do we do that at the same time put enough money into a reserve so that we can hopefully not repeat that which we've gone through? At the same time, it's quite possible that as Prop 30 begins to sunset, that, and revenues don't continue to grow as they have in past years, which is historically probably not likely, there's still a huge need for revenue, including Prop 30 or some version of it. And how do you sell that to voters if we've got billions of dollars in a reserve, and at the same time we're so underfunded in something as critically important as education? How does that get resolved?
It's very difficult. I mean, it's really hugely problematic because the voters' perception is going to be, as you say, you're sitting on this enormous sum of money, even though the reality is, as we've seen through all of these different recessions that we've experienced, that kind of reserve can be wiped out like this. And ultimately, I think the responsibility rests with all of us to try and educate the voters as to the importance of having not simply an appropriate reserve, but some of these other mechanisms that I talked about in order to basically guard against and mitigate that volatility. I think that there isn't a magic formula in terms of that balance. I think if we're trying to achieve a certain level of spending and a certain investment in both human and physical infrastructure, we have to take a bit of a long view, and we have to understand that that's something that we're going to build toward over time, and that it may ultimately mean going back to the voters or making a decision here in the legislature to increase revenues for that purpose, because we believe it's appropriate to make that investment. That is different from putting a mechanism in place to set aside spikes in revenue. And I think if I could offer some, so again, it's clearly a balance. You want to do some of both. You should do some of both in this type of year. The one kind of signpost I think I could offer is to think about what amount of money is truly one-time and non-recurring in nature. And either put that money in a reserve or spend it for one-time purposes, but don't invest it in an ongoing program, because that's the trap.
It's too enticing to use those volatile dollars, those non-recurring dollars, to get us from 8,300 per pupil in spending to 93 or to 10,000. That's not the way to do it.
It'll just ultimately catch up with you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Any other questions? Well, we're going to skip over Dr. Rubin for just a moment. We'll stick to our printed agenda. And welcome, Mr. Williams. Good to see you again.
Thank you very much. It's very good to be here. What I'd like to do this afternoon is focus most of my discussion on an implementation issue related to the governor's proposal, and specifically the use of capital gains as sort of a trigger for contributions into the reserve. But before I go into that, and by the way, I do have handouts here that I am going to be speaking from, especially the pictures that start on about page 3 or so.
We love pictures.
Yeah. Some of which you've seen before, but some perhaps you haven't. But before I go into that, I just would like to kind of echo comments that have been made earlier today, that I think that the goal of reserve proposals, whether it's ACA 4, the governor's proposal, the goal of stabilizing program funding over a cycle and avoiding overcommitments of non-recurring revenues they're laudable goals. They are laudable goals. And I'm also very supportive of the provisions in the governor's proposal to create a Proposition 98 reserve. I think that without going into the details, whether the reserve resides within the districts or whether it's set aside in a separate fund, either way, we know from the last few years that we have had just absolutely extraordinary spikes in Proposition 98 funding as well as revenues, and not cushioning for those within 98 is going to continue in the future to create real problems for that. So, two areas that I feel very strongly are very positive attributes of the proposal. But I think, as Tim had mentioned earlier, and I think some of the preceding speakers have mentioned, that any kind of reserve proposal that puts in a formula runs the risk of, will it survive or work under changing fiscal circumstances that are bound to occur over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And so that is a challenge, and there is a tension, I think, between putting formulas, especially in the Constitution, doing that because perhaps in the past we haven't had very good success not having the provisions in the Constitution. There's a tension between the lack of control you have in the future versus the idea that, well, if we don't put something in the Constitution, when you come down to the tension between the great demand for a variety of public services that have been starved, over the last several years, and the building reserve, that the reserve will lose out. So I think that has been a problem, and it's going to continue to be a challenge. But turning more specifically to the governor's proposal, on the capital gains, I certainly in principle can see the appeal of looking at capital gains and segregating that revenue source as a source, much like some of the states may have done severance taxes, where you have a source that is extremely volatile and that you set it aside during high times and use the money when revenues fall. But as you know and as you've heard, capital gains are not the only source of volatility in our revenue system. They are the single most volatile source. But as I'll show in a couple of my charts, volatility shows up in a lot of different places. And more importantly, though, is using capital gains as a benchmark for reserve contributions has a big practical challenge. And again, you've heard this, but capital gains, actual capital gains, we don't know what they are for any year after 2011 right now. It is 2014, and we have actual data for 2011. We have very preliminary partial data for 2012. We have nothing for 2013 and nothing for 2014. So, we have nothing for a source that we know moves up and down dramatically. So, as a practical matter, to base decisions about how much money you're going to set aside in any particular year on something that you have no knowledge of even the current year, much less forecast for the budget year, I think is very, very problematic. As I'll show you, if you look back at past years, there have been major differences in estimates between the two forecasting agencies, the legislative analysts and the Department of Finance, not only about the future level of capital gains, but where they are in the then current year, and sometimes even in previous years before the forecasts were made. So that's going to raise questions of, well, when you get to that decision point late in the year, and you might have two agencies that have very different estimates, who's going to be in charge? If the legislature were in charge, how would you go about making a decision? And again, it would just add another element to the what is already a very complex and very compressed budget discussion. So I would suggest that if one is interested in basing a set-aside for reserve on what we would consider to be sort of excess revenues, that we look at something that is available much more currently. And why not just broaden it out and look at all revenues? Because, after all, the volatility does exist in just about every place in the state general fund. So the next couple of charts sort of illustrate these points. You see this chart on capital gains. Yes, they are volatile. The contributions they've made to the general fund, right now they're around 10%, but in terms of dollars, in the last decade, they have contributed as little as $2 billion and as much as $12 billion a year. So yes, they are a volatile source. But if you go to the next chart, what you'll see is they're not the only volatile source. And what this is it's, you see there's 3 lines here. The red line is just total general fund revenues,
So
year
I'm
to
going to
year
interrupt
percent
just briefly
change.
because we don't have the color version. So
Oh, I'm very sorry.
We have a light, medium, dark.
Okay, I think this will be the one that has the greatest amplitude. That would be the total revenues.
Yes.
And let me look and see.
So you're saying total revenues.
The dark. It's the dark line.
Right.
The dark line, year-to-year percent change in total general fund tax proceeds, not all general fund revenues, but all general fund tax proceeds. And you can see that that total has been obviously very volatile, and some of that volatility has been driven by capital gains. It's grown as much as 20% in some years, has fallen as much as almost 20% in other years. The middle, I guess the lighter line, which is the one that almost has the same amplitude as the line we've just been talking about. What that is general fund revenues if I back out capital gains. So it's all revenues other than revenues attributable to capital gains. And you can see there that it is almost as volatile as capital gains. Now, a little aside here, I think is sort of important, an important qualification, is that capital gains directly affect revenues each year based on the amount that's claimed on tax returns, but they also certainly have effects on other revenue sources. For example, stock options that show up in wages are driven by capital gains. So that wouldn't be in the total line, it would be in the other one. You know, when you have extraordinary levels of capital gains, people feel wealthier, they spend more money, that shows up as higher taxable sales, but it has been driven by capital gains. So capital gains are very important. I don't want to diminish their importance in the overall volatility of the revenue structure, but they are not the only source. The next point I'd just like to make is that it goes back to this issue of we don't really know what capital gains are. Now, as I indicated a second ago, they maybe aren't the only source of volatility, but you could still use them as a bellwether for revenue volatility, given they have effects on other revenue sources. But I think we come back then to the very serious practical problem that you have when you rely on capital gains as a measure for determining whether you have excess revenues and whether you should start putting money into a reserve. And what this side-by-side bar charts are meant to show is differences in 2 past years. I don't have a comprehensive historical record here, but I looked at public documents of the LAO's May review of the governor's budget. And in 2011 and in 2013, they talked about differences in capital gains assumptions. In 2011, you see here the higher bar is the LAO's estimate of capital gains in 2010, the year before the estimate was even made. And the Department of Finance estimate was much lower. I mean, the difference is something like $63 billion versus about $47 billion. So this is looking back at a prior year and coming up with dramatically different conclusions about what capital gains are. So again, if you're being asked to make judgments about are we above that 6.5% threshold or are we below, we're off by almost 25% here between the 2 agencies. And in 2013, that is their current year differences. LAO is over 70 billion. The Department of Finance is less than 60 billion. Not quite as large of a difference, but still that could be the difference between a set-aside and no set-aside. So this is just meant to drive home the point that has been made by me and earlier speakers that capital gains is a tough measure in practice to be using to make decisions about how much money you should be setting aside. One alternative that I would suggest, if one wanted to continue this concept of saying, look, we're going to set aside money when we have good revenue years, would be to use just total revenues. And at the May revision, you would look at what you had through April. Yes, I think Jason had indicated earlier that June is, sometimes a big revenue month, but you have a pretty good picture of what the current year revenues look like. One could make the calculation revenues as a percentage of statewide personal income. You'll have personal income for half a year and a pretty good idea of what it is for the rest of the year. So you'd have a much better sense of where you sort of stand versus some sort of benchmark, whatever you decide to make it. It would at least be based on real information, collections through 10 months of the year, and personal income as reported by the Bureau of Economic Analysis for at least the first half of the year. And you'd have to estimate half, but personal income doesn't go up and down anything like revenues do. So that would be, I think, a better kind of measure if one were to want to rely on performance of revenues as an indicator for whether you want to set aside money into a reserve. So just as sort of quick concluding comments, I think that the administration proposal, benches everything on this concept of excess revenues. I think one thing I would want to kind of warn against is that it is conceivable that you could be in a situation where you're not really in an excess revenue situation for several years, but that doesn't mean you're not going to need reserves. Reserves protect against economic fluctuations first and foremost, but they also protect against unanticipated lawsuits or negative outcomes to lawsuits, to deficiencies in budgets, to emergencies that may come up. And so in my view, it would be important in any reserve sort of proposal to retain at least some annual contributions. Now, the contributions, there could be exemptions, certainly in down years, but even early years of recovery. But at some point, it could be sliding scale, start small, build as you move into recovery. The concept of more routine contributions, even if they're modest, is probably going to result in a healthier reserve over time, and a reserve that would protect you in circumstances where you didn't have the real frothy revenues in one year, but you might have 2 or 3 years, and you might have a bad revenue estimate, or a revenue estimate that turned out badly, I guess I should say, and revenues come up short, or you have problems that materialize in the budget. So that would be one other comment. And then just to close again, I think if to the extent that you do use some sort of revenue measure, I just don't think capital gains would work particularly well, because I think that you would, again, have big debates in May and June over what in the world the level of capital gains is. That would detract from other things that are probably more important in the budget deliberations.